Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second of our double header today. Adam Wakeling, 8 hours ago, began us off in the Japanese war crimes, but we're back to the ETO again now. And the trial of Klaus Barbie in 1987 is widely discussed in France, where I live. His crimes were many and horrific, and the case caused the French to question their own role in World War II. Richard Golsan, author of Justice in Lyon, joins me to discuss this trial and its legacy and its significance legally across the world. So I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, Richard. How are you today?
Good. Thank you very much for having me.
So before we get into the trial itself, the Barbie trial is kind of two things at the same time, isn't it? It's both an individual trial of a particular war criminal who had been wanted for a long time, and there's the whole story of his capture, and then it's also a big stepping stone in legal procedure about what can be considered crimes against humanity within a war setting. You wrote about Vichy France before. You've written about the legal aspect. Before we get into the presentation, is the trial of Barbie so understood it's almost difficult to kind of dig through the weeds and the misunderstandings about it, or do people generally have a good sense of what it was all about?
Yeah, I think that the first thing that's important to point out is France's first trial for crimes against humanity. That's the first time crimes against humanity law was tested in the French system, and by definition, and I'll talk about this briefly in my presentation, the term was problematic and the application in the Barbie trial was difficult, but it also expanded the definition to the degree that in French law, in the Barbie trial, crimes against humanity are usually crimes against ethnicities, obviously in the Holocaust against Jews. But in 1985, the law was expanded in French law to allow for some crimes against the resistance to be included. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So on a certain level, the Barbie trial had a certain historic, it was the trial of one man for his crimes, but it was also kind of a testing area for the application of this law for the first time in France. It set the stage in France itself, it set the stage for two subsequent trials, and there would have been three had not the third person been murdered by a crazy person. But basically, after the Barbie trial, the French recognized that it's all fine and dandy to try, a Nazi, a German, for crimes against humanity. But if the law is going to have any real substance or credibility, the French also needed to try French collaborators for trials for crimes against humanity. So the result of that is that the Barbie trial set the stage and kind of provided the impetus for the two subsequent trials that did take place. The trial of Paul Touvier in 1994 and the trial of Maurice Papon in 1997-98.
Brilliant stuff. Well, I'm going to hand it over to you for the presentation part of the day, and then we'll open it up to questions and discussions, and I'll throw up relevant images as we go along. So over to you. Take us through what you have prepared.
Okay. I thought I would start with just a very brief presentation of Barbie's life, his role in wartime France, his post-war career, such as it was, and then the trial, and then the legal build up to the trial, because that's extremely important. In order to understand the Barbie trial, you have to understand developments in French law in the post-war era, and also efforts in the immediate post-war era to bring justice to Nazis who'd come into France and committed all sorts of crimes. The first thing to point out about Barbie, he was born in 1913 in Bad Godesberg, so a young boy during World War I. Barbie was the child of two school teachers. His father was a headmaster. One of the things about Barbie that may or may not be relevant is his parents were not married when he was born. So technically, Barbie was a bastard. The other thing that's really important about Barbie's childhood is that his father fought in World War I from the beginning to the very end of the trial. Excuse me, I just have to cut off a reboot there. And the father was gravely wounded during the war and suffered physically after the war. As a result of that, when he drank, he became very violent. And so Barbie was the victim of child abuse. And that could or could not be an important aspect of his psychological development. The other thing is that Barbie had a mentally handicapped little brother who he was very fond of, and his father and his brother died pretty early in his life. So to the degree that we can look at a background, personal background to someone to determine how they become the way they are, those are some considerations to keep in mind. Barbie very early on was attracted to Nazism. He had a real distaste for the French from other childhood experiences. When he became involved with the Nazi Party, first by way of spying on some of his classmates for the party. So Barbie always had the kind of secret agent spy mentality about him. Then he went to work for the Gestapo, for the Nazi police at various points, and he was essentially a vice squad member. And in that capacity, among other things, Barbie had dealings with prostitute, drug dealers, things like that. Barbie showed a penchant, apparently, very early on for violence and of violence towards women. And this, to a certain degree, sets the stage for a few of the more important witnesses at the trial and also his victims during the war. So when war comes, Barbie is first sent to Holland, where he is involved with deportation of Jews from Amsterdam. Not long after that, he's transferred to France. And then in 1942, in November 1942, when the Germans occupied theoretically the unoccupied zone, which it was called, Barbie is sent to Lyon, where he is basically second in command in the Gestapo in Lyon. His boss is a fairly minor figure. Barbie clearly became the force to reckon with in Lyon. And a lot of descriptions of Barbie during that era when he is in Lyon, not only emphasize his absolute brutality with Jews and resistance figures, but also his kind of mafia-like persona. Apparently, he liked to walk through the streets of Lyon with his German Shepherd dog. He had a mistress, even though he had a wife and daughter back in Germany. He spent a lot of money. He lived a pretty loose lifestyle, but also was very efficient and effective, not only in the suppression of Jews, but of the resistance itself. Two victims during the war I thought I would emphasize at this stage, because this gives you an idea of what Barbie functioned like during the war. And both were women, and I think that's very crucial. The Barbie trial emphasized not only Barbie's violence, but his penchant for violence against women. So that is a real dimension of the trial and of his crimes during the war. The two women who would later go on to testify at the trial, one was named Lise Lesèvre. She was a resistance member. The other one was named Simone Kadosh, who was an adolescent during the war, and you can see the pictures there. Lise Lesèvre, up in the upper left-hand corner, was captured by Barbie. She was a courier for the resistance. Captured by Barbie, tortured repeatedly in order to make her name her superior. She would not do it, and so Barbie said, "Well, in that case, I'll arrest your son and your husband." And he did it, and he deported them, and they both died. So this gives you a sense of the kind of the no holds bar approach that Barbie used. Simone Kadosh on the bottom, later Simone Kadosh Lagrange, her married name, was, I believe, 13 years old when Barbie arrested her and her parents and brought them into his office. What he was looking for were her siblings, who had been hidden away so as not to be deported. And in fact, neither the parents nor Simone Kadosh knew where the siblings were. But when Barbie did not get satisfaction from the parents, he proceeded to torture Simone Kadosh, 13-year-old girl, in front of the parents, which is probably about as horrific an experience as one can have as a parent. And then he deported both the father and the mother died in deportation. Simone Kadosh was deported but returned to survive and to testify at the trial. But those are two examples among literally hundreds of examples of the kind of violence Barbie was willing to inflict on others. Of course, Barbie's most famous victim was the resistance leader Jean Moulin. And they're still, in this part, I'm going to admit to not being absolutely sure what the final status of his death is, but because there are multiple accounts. But one thing is sure is that Barbie tortured him within an inch of his life. And shortly after he left Lyon, he died anyway. But that's what Barbie was known for, because Jean Moulin became kind of the iconic representative of the French resistance. And so Barbie's name was forever linked to Jean Moulin. With the liberation, I guess I should mention the three crimes. Well, let me hold on that and mention those when we get to the trial itself. But at the end of the war, at the liberation, Barbie escapes back to Germany. He reunites with his family, has a son, and is, through a friend, goes to work for the American CIC, which is the Counterintelligence Corps. And they hired Barbie essentially because they knew that he knew a good deal about France. And because this was already the Cold War, they wanted to use Klaus Barbie to spy on the French. His handlers considered him efficient for the most part. One famously described him as a Nazi idealist. Several of them did not believe, in fact, that Barbie was capable of torture, which, of course, he'd been performing in Lyon for years. Under any circumstances, the French at this point are aware sooner or later that Barbie is working for the Americans. And so they want to have access to Barbie for his crimes in France. In fact, they want to try him in France. So because Barbie knows a lot about the American intelligence, and because Americans are convinced that the French are infiltrated with communists in the Cold War period, they decide to evacuate Barbie and his family on the rat line, the infamous rat line. So in 1951, I believe, Barbie, his wife, his daughter, and his son are all sent to Italy and then secreted out to South America. Through Argentina, they finally settle in Bolivia, where Barbie becomes quite wealthy, becomes a successful businessman. He becomes a friend of right-wing dictators who protect him. And he lives under the name of Klaus Altmann until he's finally discovered basically in the 1970s. But Barbie, because he is protected by these dictators, is actually not sent back to France to stand trial until 1983. And that follows the change of government in Bolivia, in this instance, from a right-wing, dictatorship to a left-wing government. And so that government is willing to deal with the French to extradite Barbie back to France. And that when he's taken back to France, it's a huge national event in France in 1983. The first night, and on your picture on your right, the first night when they take Barbie to Lyon, they put him in the prison of Montluc, where he had tortured and so many of his victims, and where he had lodged them during the war. Then he's put in prison. At that point in time, what's called the instruction, the investigation of the case, begins in 1983 to prepare the ground for the trial. And so we're at the stage where we're going to talk about the trial, and therefore at a stage where we have to talk about the post-war legal history in France that sets the stage for the trial. So, as we already mentioned, Barbie escapes to Germany and then through the rat line gets to South America. But he is tried in absentia twice for war crimes in France. He's tried in 1952 and 1954 and convicted of war crimes and sentenced to death, because the death penalty exists in French law at that time. But he is convicted in absentia. Again, Barbie is now in South America. After about 1954, there's a period of essentially burying the World War II past in France. France is trying to move on from the war. But in 1964, there's another major legal development. And that is that because in French law, crimes of war have a statute of limitations of 20 years, then it's 20 years in 1964 from the moment of the liberation. At that point, the French legislature votes into French law a statute concerning crimes against humanity. And the crucial point is, two crucial points. One is that crimes against humanity have no statute of limitations in French law, so that if one is charged with that, you can be charged 50 years later, as Barbie was, or 40 years later. The second point is that when the law is incorporated into French law, it is not defined. That is to say, the statute basically says crimes against humanity is defined at Nuremberg or incorporated into French law, but there is no technical definition. Okay, so that sets the stage for the Barbie trial in the following way. First, the statute of limitations on war crimes has run out, so Barbie can only be tried for crimes against humanity, and that is what he will be tried for. But the second point about this is that Barbie has committed crimes against the resistance, obviously, in the person of Jean Moulin, among many others, as well as Jews. So traditionally, crimes against humanity only cover crimes against Jews or ethnicities, and do not cover enemy combatants. In fact, at Nuremberg, of course, that's not in consideration. The problem here is that because Barbie is best known in France for his murder or his torture and the death of Jean Moulin, resistance groups want him tried for that crime as well, not for the murder of Jean Moulin, which is kind of on a technicality, but other resistance victims. So in 1985, 2 years before the actual trial, and then 2 years after Barbie is already in prison, the French Court of Appeals effectively changes or rewrites the definition of crimes against humanity in French law to include some victims, some resistance victims, not every resistance victim, but under special circumstances, some resistance victims. The net effect of this is essentially to divide the plaintiffs in the trial, because if you ask someone like Serge Klarsfeld, he does not believe resistance victims should be included among the victims of crimes against Barbie's crimes against humanity. Okay, that's an important thing. On the other side, the French resistance lawyers and the French resistance victims want to be included, but there is that tension when the trial gets underway, and it essentially kind of explodes on the scene at various points during the trial. So fast forward now to 1987, and Barbie is ready to stand trial. The trial takes place from May to July in Lyon, because assize court trials take place where the crimes are committed. By any measure, until recently, that was an extremely long assize court trial. And you have in front of you the Palais de Justice in Lyon, because this was, for all intents and purposes, a kind of world historical event. That building in front of you holds several different courts. But what the French justice system decided to do is turn the entirety of that building into the courtroom for the trial of Klaus Barbie. So it looked essentially like an auditorium rather than a traditional small assize courtroom. So there are basically 3 charges against Barbie at this trial. There are many other minor charges, but there are essentially 3. The first one was that in 1943, I believe in February 1943, Barbie apparently, and this remains a little bit dubious, ordered the roundup of Jews who came to the UGIF, the Union Générale des Israélites Françaises. And the point was that he rounded them up when they came in, because the Jews arrived at that point to get food and to get some kind of support. So he knew about the UGIF, and he ordered the roundup. The second crime, which occurred in 1944 in April, is the most famous and most heinous of Barbie's crimes. And this one, there's very little doubt that he was involved directly with this. And that is that there was a school where Jewish children were hidden in a village called Isieux, about 30 or 40 kilometers, I believe, from Lyon. Barbie got wind of the presence of these children through a local essentially a local peasant or farmer sympathetic to the Nazis. And so he went out, rounded up those children and their teachers, and deported them. And these children were, ranged in age, I think, from 8 to like 15. But this kind of crime against children, strikes most of us, and certainly struck the court and the French as the most horrific of his crimes. The last crime against humanity that he was charged with was the deportation of Jews and resistance fighters on a last train that left Lyon in August 1944. Okay, when they arrived at the border, Jews are separated out from resistance fighters and they go to different camps. But those are the three big crimes, those are the three major crimes Barbie is charged with. And that's essential. Those are the stakes when the trial gets underway. A couple of words about the participants in the trial are that in the French Assize court, you don't have what's called the judge, you have what's called the président, the president of the court. And basically, the man's name in the Barbie trial was André Seldini. And Seldini oversees, for the most part, and interrogates the witnesses and interrogates the accused. Very different role, certainly from the American system. The state prosecutor was Pierre Truche, a very interesting and I think individual, and pretty much in a lot of ways the hero of the trial, because it was his statement or summation at the end that brought together these two strands that were pulling apart. That is, he justified why it was legitimate to find Klaus Barbie guilty of crimes against humanity for crimes against Jews and resistance. And he did a brilliant job of it. The defense lawyer is probably the most famous character to emerge from the trial, or who was known before the trial and ever since, and died, I think, maybe 15 years ago, something like that, was Jacques Vergès, down in my view, the far right corner. Vergès was a maverick, very controversial lawyer, friends and defender of a lot of particularly disturbing people historically. He was a friend of Pol Pot's. He was at one point was brought on to defend Saddam Hussein. He was a defender and advisor of Milosevic, the Serbian dictator. But he was paid in the Barbie trial. He was paid by a Nazi sympathizer, Swiss financier, to essentially to blow up the trial, to do his very best to not only to get Barbie off, but mostly to cast the blame back on the French for their own crimes. So Jacques Vergès employed two other assistant defense lawyers. One was an Algerian named Nabil Bouaïta, and the other one was a Congolese lawyer named Jean-Martin Mbemba. And what Jacques Vergès' defense consisted in was not to try particularly hard to get Barbie off on the trial, on the charges against him. In fact, he did a very poor job of that as a rule. His real purpose was to impose what in French law is called a trial by rupture. Rather than try to defend the accused, he tried to turn the accusations of crimes against humanity away from the defendant towards the court and towards the French nation itself. And what he essentially argued is, well, the Nazis did a lot of bad things, but look at what French colonialism did for many, many more years, and the oppression and the crimes committed, the untold numbers of crimes against humanity committed by French colonists. That was one of the reasons, and European colonists. And so that was the reason that he brought in Nabil Bouaïta from Algeria, and then Jean-Martin Mbemba, because these were both obviously countries that had been colonized in many ways brutally by the French. The strategy didn't work. In a lot of ways, Vergès never intended it to work. He would like it to have worked, but a trial is not about, it's not tu quoque. You cannot just defend yourself by saying, well, you did worse. But what he did do was, depending on one's perspective, disrupt the understanding of the trial and raise questions about the guilt of the French people rather than the guilt of the Nazis. In fact, one of the descriptions by the French philosopher Alain Finkielkraut was that in Vergès's eyes, he tried to present the crimes of the Nazis as just one drop in the ocean of human suffering. I think that's the phrase he used. In other words, diminish the Nazi crimes by situating them in comparison to of all the crimes of white people and of Europeans in history. So those are I think the main points for this. I hope I haven't spoken too long. I wanted to make sure.
Brilliant.
To walk you through those. So I'm more than happy now to talk about any aspect of the trial or any of the individuals involved.
Well, brilliant. I mean, let's talk about Barbie himself at the trial, because to say he's uncooperative is a bit of an understatement, isn't it? I mean, he knows the spotlight is on him, doesn't it? So, I mean, you said at the beginning about he had a troubled childhood, which doesn't excuse anything, but it helps us understand things. Because of the length of time, because, I mean, he must have known, even in Bolivia, he must have known about the trials that took place in France in the 1950s. He must have known, like, I don't know, like Dillinger or Capone, that he's on this sort of list of wanted. So he'd had time, in a sense, to mentally prepare for the possibility, of ever having to face his accusers.
That's right.
How did he go into it? What was his approach?
Barbie, never accepted. Barbie remained a Nazi till the end of his life. So for him, the French justice was a joke or not even legitimate in his view. So that was his attitude. He never wanted to apologize for anything. He never thought, as a true blue Nazi, he never thought he did anything wrong. After all, he was serving the Reich and the German people and Hitler. So in the trial, what Barbie did was there were a couple of ploys. One was that in Bolivian law, if I understand this correctly, in order to be extradited, that has to have the permission of the Bolivian Supreme Court. That's not what happened. Basically, the French government made a deal with the new Bolivian government to take him out of Bolivia and put him on trial in France. So his first claim was, I've been kidnapped, I'm illegitimately on trial, so this is a sham. The second thing that Barbie did, which was probably what the French would call a coup de théâtre, was that he made a point of early on in the trial of saying, okay, I'm done. I'm not attending this trial anymore. Because it's unjust, it's a sham, I'm not attending. And the problem with that is, first of all, you can do that in a French assize court trial. The accused has the right to not appear in trial. The president has the possibility of bringing him back for particular points, but he does have that. So given that the Barbie trial, that Barbie himself was the star of the show, for lack of a better word, Barbie's disappearance took away a lot of the theatrical dimension of the trial. And when I first started working on the book, I ran across a fascinating piece pointing out that when Barbie left the trial, something like half or more of the international journalists covering the trial left and went home because they thought, no, there's no there. There's no Klaus Barbie. So what's the point? And at the very end of the trial, the other thing that Barbie disguised was that he pretended early in the trial that he did not speak French, that he did not remember French. So, he kind of faked that out. And then at the very end of a French assize court trial, he's brought back for the sentencing and for the jury to go out and ask. And he's given in a French assize court trial, the last person who has the right to speak is the accused. And so Barbie says he's brought back in the stands, and then to the amazement of everyone, he addresses the court. And what he says is basically, I committed crimes, but the war is over, and I fought honorably, and that's it. So the war is over, forget it, let's move on. Never admitted guilt about anything. He just said he did it as a loyal Nazi. And, clearly, to a certain degree in his own mind, that's what he believed. So Barbie was never, how should we put this, a good defendant in the sense that he did not defend himself very personally. And the second thing is he certainly voiced no repentance about his actions. But when I met with Serge Klarsfeld, one of the times that he was kind enough to speak with me about this, he said that he was happy that that Barbie absented himself because he did not believe that Jacques Vergès knew Barbie's file well enough to defend him well anyway. Barbie was the only man who had the knowledge to defend himself. So on a certain level, you could argue, in fact, that that Barbie absenting himself from his own trial damaged his cause. I don't think there's any real question that Barbie would have been found guilty of the charges because there was so much evidence against him. But the fact of the matter is, he may have, in some ways, compromised his own defense.
Mm. I mean, Mag, my other half, who's watching in the other room, and is French. She says, and she's watched the big French documentary recently, is that she was blown away because she was too young really to remember it back. Well, she was a teenager back at the time, but how well the eyewitnesses spoke, how strong they were, pretty much to a man and woman. They all came on. And do you think that may have that was part of the fact of their strength, was that Barbie wasn't there for the majority of it, sitting there staring at his face in their faces and kind of dismissing what they're saying with eye rolls, things like that. Although, as much as if I was the victim of something and I had an opportunity to present evidence against the person who'd committed crimes against me and my family, I think I would want the person to be there.
That's
when
right.
I'm doing my bit, but I'm used to public speaking, so it's a very different thing.
Yeah, there's a really interesting dimension to that. When in the French legal system, during the investigation of the case, the witnesses are brought in to do confrontations with the accused. And many of them found that incredibly traumatic in the sense that Barbie, he may not be the same man he was, he was diminished, he was ill, but to them, he was still this horrifying monster that had tortured them. And so they asked all of these people, as the trial was about to take place, are you willing to testify? And some said no, because they were still terrified of him. The other thing is that, so I think the question is actually can be asked the other way. If Barbie had been present, would his presence have been so intimidating from some of the witnesses that they couldn't have made as strong as statements as they did? And there are several instances in the trial itself, which you can, watch on the films of the trial, where some of them are essentially overwhelmed as soon as they see him, and others become enraged and start screaming at him and demanding that he answer things. And that's not permissible under the French system. So these are the moments where the trial looks like it may, come to pieces. And it's up to the president, André Saldini, who did a great job to keep order in the courtroom. But so on that level, I think probably on balance, it would be safe to say that for some of the accused, it was better that he wasn't there, in the sense that they did not feel his intimidating presence.
The other thing I think we need to address, you partly talked about it, is the very public nature of this trial. In that, in my lifetime, the number of trials that are really absolutely out there in the public eye, I can't think of like more than the fingers of one hand. I think O.J. Simpson maybe, and Barbie is one of them. So from the very minute that when they brought him back in '83 and they put him in the cell in the prison in Lyon, there's a certain amount of showmanship isn't the word, but there's a sense of there's an attempt to make this a very public thing. So people are going to draw strong emotions from that within France at a time in the 1980s when there are plenty of 60-something, 70-something, 80-something French people who are going through the very process of questioning their own role in the war. And do you think a little bit of it, Richard, is that like the shaving heads of women who slept with the Germans in 44 in the liberation, is that Barbie can become that symbolic figurehead of everything that's bad, and you can kind of transfer your bit of your own guilt as a French person to Barbie and Barbie's associate.
So Barbie as a kind of a scapegoat. I think there are two dimensions of that. One is that Barbie kept threatening that he was going to tear off the lid and reveal all these people in power in high places in France that had been collaborators. So there are a lot of people that some, for that, whether they were guilty or not, didn't want the trial to be turned into this opportunity for Barbie to denounce people, because Barbie was a known liar. So I mean, he could make up things about anybody, and he did. But I also think that when Jean Moulin's ashes were put into the Pantheon as the symbol of the resistance in 1964, and the writer Andre Malraux, who was then, I think, Minister of Culture, gave his famous speech. Barbie, became the symbol of Nazism in France, perhaps in the same way that you could say Eichmann was the symbol of Nazism in Israel. So there was that, and the trial was symbolic. But there, on that level, there's another point, though, that I think is worth mentioning, is that, and this I was not aware of until I went to work on the book, is that Barbie really was understood by the French until he was arrested and brought back, and more became clear about his activities during the war. He was thought of as the man who martyred Jean Moulin.
Yeah.
His role in the deportations and the persecution of Jews was completely underestimated, and in fact, almost, for people who knew, it was very real, but for others, it was kind of non-existent. And what became clear as the trial drew closer, and as Barbie was accused of things like the deportation of the children of Lisieux, that shifted the memory away from the martyrdom of the resistance to the victimization of the Jews in France. And that definitely implicated the French themselves more than the first narrative about the martyrdom of resistance heroes. So Barbie affected a kind of a transition of memory that in some ways was uncomfortable for the French.
The fact that Lyon was his base of operations, I can't help thinking that it was almost the perfect storm, because Lyon was a place of a big amount of French resistance. It depends where you are in France as to how strong the resistance is, depending on what there is in the way of mountains and forests and support and politics and things like that. But Lyon was a place where there was lots going on. I don't like doing what if history, but for the sake of it, if he'd ended up being posted to some other city in France, I don't know. Marseille had its amount of intrigue in the war. Paris, I don't know. There was obviously clues in his childhood that he had these particular, aspects of his personality. And as a fervent, loyal Nazi, he was going to find opportunities wherever he went. But was Lyon, in a sense, the worst place for him to be, given there was so much activity there? He's a busy man. Essentially, he was a very busy man during the war.
Yeah, and I'm not a specialist on the resistance, but I would certainly say that is very likely the case. I think he started out in Gex, and I don't know much about that. But he didn't become who he is until he's in Lyon, and he really doesn't become who he is until he gets his hands on Jean Moulin. The arrest of Jean Moulin, even today, if you go to Lyon and visit where Jean Moulin and the head of the resistance, the heads of the resistance were gathered in Caluire, in this suburb of Lyon.
Yeah.
That in itself is a story that most French people, certainly, I don't know about now, but certainly knew pretty much by heart, because of course that involved the French traitor René Aldi. So there's all sorts of connections with not only the city of Lyon, but the mythical figure or the legendary figure of Jean Moulin, the legendary traitor René Aldi, who became a very interesting character in his own right after the war. I think Barbie was kind of, as you put it, kind of a perfect storm where in being positioned or put into Lyon. Why he would be put there, what I don't know anything about his real military, his Nazi records, but I think he was considered efficient and brutal. He clearly had that reputation. There's no doubt, but everyone who testified or knew him, including his own subordinates, thought he was excessive and clearly sadistic. So,
I thank you for the response to that. He's obviously, to some extent, he's power hungry. He's looking to move up through the ranks. He's obviously, he likes a bit of the attention on himself. He wants to be seen. He's got a megalomaniac and ambitions. The unfortunate thing, if you want to just study French resistance, as people do, and forget about war crimes, forget about Nazis, the problem is you cannot take him out of the Jean Moulin story, because he never did reveal what information he had about the arrest of Moulin in the house. He kept that, what he knew, secret. As you said earlier, we don't even know exactly how Jean Moulin died. So if you wanted to write a book about Jean Moulin and Patrick Barham did a few years ago, you have to end up bringing Black Barbie into the story, because of the question mark. You cannot talk about Moulin without leaving these question marks. So in a weird way, Barbie, not in a weird way, in a very real way, he's achieved immortality because we cannot take him out of the story of France's arguably greatest World War II hero.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. You raise that point, raises another fascinating thing for me that I think about, since I'm now working on as I told you, on the terrorism trials, is, if you look at the two trials that took place following the Barbie trial of French collaborators. So Paul Touvier, who was a thug and a member of the milice, had worked with Barbie in Lyon, and then Maurice Papon, who was an official who worked in Bordeaux during the war and was involved with the Nazis in deporting Jews from Bordeaux. Both were found guilty. But the really big fish was, of course, René Bousquet. And René Bousquet was the one who essentially made the pact with the Nazis for the deportation of Jews from France. So he is responsible for the Holocaust in France. So he's about to stand trial, and he's murdered in the summer of 1995. So on a certain level, Barbie didn't spill the beans about what he really knew. He lied about it. And then, unfortunately for the French, René Bousquet was never able to be tried. So the details of that, who was involved with agreeing and organizing the deportations from France, Bousquet is killed. And then if you look at, like I say, these terrorism trials, and the most famous one, the one for the November 13th attacks, only one terrorist survived to tell what happened, and he didn't talk really. And the point is, the big fish are killed. So there's a certain level in all these trials where the trial is dependent on either the accused telling the story that everybody wants to hear, or the accused not being present, in which case the trial feels kind of empty on a certain level, or finally, in the case of the terrorism trials, these men are dead. So yeah, I think it's really true. But Barbie, I think one other point that we should make is Barbie was the subject of an Academy Award-winning documentary called Hotel Terminus, which is just an incredible film. And so he was also immortalized, so to speak, by that great film made by Marcel Ophuls. And you can, if you teach documentary, a lot of people teach documentary, just use parts of that film to teach how documentaries are done. So Barbie is a how should we put this? He's with us for good. I mean, I don't want he's a bit in that level. It's a bit of the O.J. Simpson phenomenon in this country. That is that O.J. is bigger than what he actually was because of what he's remembered for and what he was connected to and all those kinds of things.
You talked earlier about it being a very key point in the progression of international law and this greater idea of crimes against humanity. But I think also the Barbie trial and the Barbie discussion straddles that era of post-war France when the baddies were the Nazis, the baddies were the Third Reich, goose-stepping their way through the cities of France and mowing down resistance. And now, as I always say to people, I could go and switch on French TV right now, and there'll be a documentary about Vichy and about milice. And you've written about Vichy. We are now firmly in the era where the French aren't exactly embracing it, but they're not in any way trying to compress it or conceal it anymore. So Barbie sort of is in that bridging of that period where prior to his trial, it was all about the Nazis, but he does, because of the work of the Defense Council, start sort of spreading out the blame elsewhere, saying, but he was only part of a mechanism. Who are we to judge? We're all bad. We've all done bad things. It does change things in that regard. And William is saying in the question there, because he was committing crimes as a Nazi against Jews, his trial got more attention than perhaps a French person being a trial. I mean, you mentioned the two other trials that followed, but they didn't receive the same attention. The footage is not available to just go and download. So,
that's a really interesting question. I mean, that there's that wonderful book by Julian Jackson, by the way, about the trial of Pétain that came out in the last few years, and that was a huge national event too. But one point to be made about the Barbie trial compared to the other two trials is I was in France and I was already fascinated by Vichy at that point. The Touvier and certainly the Papon trial got a ton of attention, especially before the Papon trial came out. France was just flooded with books about Papon. I think the difference is that Papon, as you just said at the beginning of the statement, Barbie marked a transition in memory between the myth of the French victim and then the French culprit for deporting Jews and complicity in the Holocaust. By the time you get to the trials of Touvier and Papon, that issue of how guilty were the French in this instance, that's already a moot point. The point is 1990s in France is very much a period of the obsession with Vichy and of French culpability. So that's a big point. That's one reason why the Barbie trial is probably more important in the end than those two trials, even though in terms of the French reckoning with their own past, you could certainly argue that the Papon trial and the trial of René Bousquet, if it had taken place, would have been more important for the French psyche, let's say.
Yeah, oh, that makes sense. We've got your last photos there. The fact there's even a plaque commemorating its legal significance as well as commemorating victims. I mean, Lyon is I haven't been to Lyon for a few years, but one of my other half's best friends lives in Lyon. It's an incredibly bustling, modern city, but it has lots and lots of references to its past, both good and bad, and the resistance and the martyrs and the deportations and the prisons that are still there. So you see, it's a city where if you're interested in resistance and the war and Vichy, it's got everything, I suppose, to offer. It looks at that subject from every angle. Which is fascinating.
My first trip to Lyon, I had been through Lyon with groups of high school teachers, but my first real trip to Lyon to start working on this project was incredibly, what's the right way to put it? It was just a great adventure. I mean, you can go visit Montluc prison, as you mentioned. You can go to Gestapo headquarters. You can go to Place Bellecour, where there were all sorts of crimes and dead resistance members left out occasionally to terrify. So you can literally walk around. You can go to Hotel Terminus, which is right down near the Perrache train station, which is where Barbie, was, and the Nazis were housed. Certainly at the beginning of the war, and in fact, where early in the after they arrived there, they set up torture chambers in the hotel itself. So it's a wonderful city and easy to walk and see this. And then if you're researching the trial, like I say, the archives for the trial are in the archives in Lyon. That's actually not very far from where Montluc prison is. You could walk that distance pretty comfortably. So it's a great touristic city for many reasons. But if you're interested in the Barbie affair and the Barbie trial, you can see the whole thing. You could spend a day and do the whole thing. You could go over and see the Palais de Justice, which is beautiful, and then enjoy Lyon, which is a wonderful, wonderful city.
Yeah. But a great question from Stephen. When the trial happened, there was a lot of people around who'd witnessed the events, the people who'd lived in Lyon, survivors, people alongside. That era has now closed. The number of people who have any real connection, it's just a handful of children who are alive that are available these days. And, if a documentary wants to make a film about it now, it all has to be secondary. It has to be children of and historians like yourself. But Stephen is saying, has any new information come out since the trial and passage of time, any deathbed confessions? Because it is 40 years ago now, 30 years ago.
Let's see. No, 1987. Yeah. So, that's an interesting question, and there was an interesting thing for me about writing about this trial is that Barbie does not go away, and so there's a guy who's an independent writer in Austin, Texas, about 100 miles from here, named Nate Blakesley, who's writing a book about Barbie's life. So he's really plugged into this. And the book, I'm not sure how far along he is in the book. And then the other thing is, I don't know how many of you all know Jake Tapper, the American newscaster on CNN. He was writing an illustrated, what do you call it, an illustrated novel about Barbie. At least that's the last I heard. So there are people who are still absolutely digging around to try to find new information. I finished the book, and it was published in 2022, and I haven't really followed a lot of the details since, because, as I said, I've kind of switched over to the terrorism trials. But I think, no, Barbie died in 1991, didn't confess to anything. I mean, basically, he
Yeah.
kept his mouth shut, and his daughter remained an apologist for him, and Vergès never spilled the beans about anything in particular. It was particularly revealing. I think the only news that I've seen that's come across the wire in, let's say, the last, I don't know, maybe perhaps, I think it's been in the last year, is they know more about the conditions of Jean Moulin's death.
Yeah.
That that there were stories that that Moulin was dead by the time he left Montluc, but Barbie, there's no doubt that Barbie tortured him to the point of death, and there are accounts in various sources. When I was working on the book, that Barbie would do things like knock people down the stairs so they fell on their head on stone stairs. So they're terribly, terribly battered by the time.
I mean, it's interesting because I've read quite a lot about the Jean Moulin, and the books written even 40 years after the war tended to be from one camp or other. They were written by a communist sympathizer or a Gaullist or a pretend neutral observer, but none of them I felt were particularly objective. They all were coming from our guy definitely isn't the guy. It's not our guy. Look elsewhere, and so that there's that aspect of it too, which has gone. The next question I want to ask you, Richard, before we kind of bring things to an end, is that we are definitely going to be discussing during this series the how, where does blame sit in that. It's easy to look at Barbie for the psychopath he possibly was, because people are asking in the sidebar, is it true he set dogs on people? Is it? Yes, most of the things that he's accused of are probably true, and they are horrific. I mean, he's not one of these mid-management types who's sitting in office in Germany.
No.
But because of his very high profile, very deliberate, vicious nastiness, did it help or hinder in our understanding of how we processed and tried the people, the mid-management people, the people who are in charge of the Nazi trains, or the people in Vichy who are just administrators who are sitting behind desks, who never actually put a bullet to anyone's head? They never actually go out there and pray. Do you understand what I mean by the question here?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the book I worked a lot on talked a little bit about the legal precedents to the Barbie trial and the trials of these higher up folks. In terms of Barbie kind of shaping the perspective on some of these other people, it might be easiest to refer just to the two cases of Paul Touvier and Moise Papon by way of answering. And they mounted different kind. Touvier was basically a thug like Barbie. He was a small time Barbie. So what you understand about Paul Touvier, you can learn. You can look and you can see the comparison with Barbie, right? The Papon one is a more interesting one, and I don't think that Barbie's trial shaped the perspective on Papon, because that was the one that was really the trial of the Vichy regime itself. And especially in light of the fact and of the French, French elites, because Papon went on after the war to have an illustrious career. He stayed in Lyon. He worked. He was happy to turn coat and work for the Gaullists after the war, and then he's made prefect of Paris police. I think in the late 1950s, and is infamously associated with the torture and murder of Algerian protesters in October 1961. He's also becomes a minister of the budget at one point. So he's certainly a more representative figure of what, Vichy and a French government high-placed elites. And he certainly strove to distance himself from anything. Well, I didn't do anything like that. I just followed orders. I didn't know what was happening to him. And you can't know if you say, you put them on a train and they're being deported in horrible conditions, you can still say, well, I don't know what happened to him in the end. And there was a great, and I'll circle back to the Barbie trial on that one, because when Pierre Truche, the prosecutor, made his defense, one of the things that he said that I thought was incredibly astute about Barbie, he said, you cannot deport people that you've beaten or tortured or you've seen herded into cars and think that regime is ever going to let them come back home after the war to let them testify or to see these human rags that they become, because then that's going to give that regime a terrible, terrible name. So, you can imagine that most people with any intelligence and an imagination, somebody like Maurice Papon, would certainly understand that what he was doing and the fate of these people was likely going to be their deaths. But yeah, it's easy to say, look, I didn't know. How would I know?
Well, I mean, I recommended your book, and if you want to hold up the copy of your book, then folks, the links to Richard's book are in the description below. There it is there, Justice in Lyon. But because it is essentially an academic work, as well as being very readable, you do have a conclusion about the trial. You do come to a fairly firm, this is my opinion about what the trial represents. So I think to end things, we should have your conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, when I first started working on the book, a lot of the accounts of the Barbie trial, there were a lot of expectations for what it was going to be and disappointment. There were a lot of people who believed that the hybridization of the status of crimes against humanity used in the trial was basically ruined the trial from the outset because it diluted the law. My view is that justice was done. And I do think that given that the Barbie trial was a huge media circus and that the defense lawyers tried to turn it into something even more, incomprehensible or, even more confusing for the general public. My feeling is absolutely that justice was done to Barbie. There is no death sentence in France by this point in time. He was an old man. He was sick. Yeah. But he did commit these crimes, and crimes against humanity being without a statute of limitations, I think is what they should be. So I also reject the idea that if you commit a crime as horrendous or crimes as horrendous as he did 50 years ago, when somebody is 50 years old, they're not the same person. This was one of the arguments made. I don't agree with that. So my feeling is, and that's why I call the book Justice in Lyon, is I think to the degree that it was possible, justice was done all the way around.
Yeah. I mean, he may have felt individually that he kind of got away with some stuff because he didn't name names, he didn't do this. But and he didn't, he didn't go to the guillotine. He was, was it 4 years later he died in prison? But as you said, the mechanism had worked. He'd had the defense. It was the legal proceedings. He'd had due process, and due process, despite it being, as you said, there was this slight tension between the resistance crimes and the crimes against humanity. But they came through that. Everybody came through that. He was tried. He was found guilty, and as I say, justice was served. And regardless of how people think, will kind of take on board what he thought about it personally, that doesn't really matter. When you look it up on Wikipedia, the result is there. The result is he was found guilty, and it does send that message that it doesn't matter how long after an event, you can still be guilty. Just because you're old doesn't change the fact you were guilty of these horrific things. So,
and one last point is that there were other, some of the deportations of children that Barbie happily and willingly carried out. There were Nazis that were not doing this at the end of the war, if nothing else, because they were worried that they would have to really pay for that after the war. So Barbie was even fanatical by Nazi standards in terms of the crimes he committed. And the trial was ultimately not of the Nazi regime. It was the crimes of Klaus Barbie, and he was justly convicted for those crimes.
Yeah, and that the reality is, unfortunately, as we deal with this series, is that 10% is a very generous amount of how many of the Nazis were actually brought to justice. Some people think it's as low as sort of 3 or 4%, but Barbie, at least they got that one. At least one of the bastards was eventually tried and was eventually found guilty. We wish it could have been more, some of us, but justice was served in that case. So Richard, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you, folks. I'm not on tomorrow. I got a day off tomorrow. Then on Friday, we're looking at the IG Farben trials with World War II regular Dan Cazzetta. And then later on, Michael Bryant is looking at the legal framework of how the Nuremberg trials were set up back in 1945. So 2 more fantastic shows to add to this series. In the meantime, thanks everybody for sticking with us during this set of shows, because it's all a bit grim. There's not many laughs really in the war crimes discussions, but I'm glad that my audience is sticking with us. We will have some conventional sort of inventory and battle discussions next week before we go back to war crimes again. But as always, click like and subscribe, buy my guest books. But I will see you all on Friday. This is Paul Woodhead from World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.